Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Data Activism, Leveraging Advocates to Improve Public Transit. I'm Matt Dickens, the Senior Policy Analyst at APTA, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Welcome to all the APTA members and guests from across North America and the world tuning in to today's session. Today, we're bringing together a great group of panel members to show you how advocacy groups and transit agencies are working together to deliver successful public transit. In regions across the country, new groups are springing up to advocate for more and better public transit service. While transit advocates have been around for many decades, what sets apart this new generation is a data-driven approach to problem solving. They bring programming and coding skills, backgrounds in planning and engineering, and a desire to see the public sector function at the highest levels to the table. Recent advances are driving the increase in data-driven advocacy groups. Transit agencies are increasing the availability of agency data sets and especially real-time data streams. These data give advocates the opportunity to dig into serious issues like ridership and service quality and other issues faced by transit providers. In doing so, they can provide new levels of creativity and insight. These advocacy groups want transit agencies to succeed at their core mission of providing safe and reliable transportation to communities and regions. But agencies can sometimes be reluctant to engage with these advocates, since these groups can at times be critical of agency policies. However, as you'll hear from our panelists, those agencies that have chosen to have close relationships with data-driven advocates have seen positive results. And as advocates deliver positive results for the agency, those agencies are becoming more receptive to input and assistance from advocates. Today, we will hear from 4 speakers who will show you how advocates and agencies can work together to deliver positive results for public transit. There is a lot to learn from today's speakers. Get ready to take good notes and post your questions to the question box found on the screen. Your questions will be addressed in the second half of the program. As part of today's program, we are welcoming the following panel of industry leaders. Ari Ofsavit is a board member at the advocacy group Transit Matters in Boston. Jim Aloisi is another board member at Transit Matters. Joe Aiello is the chair of the MBTA Fiscal and Management Control Board. And Monica Tibbetts-Nutt is the vice chair of the MBTA Fiscal and Management Control Board. Each of our speakers will offer about 10 to 12 minutes of remarks. After each speaker, we will ask a question or two of them, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. After our last speaker, we will continue our conversation with the panelists and then open the floor for questions submitted by the audience to the question box. You can find the instructions on the screen right now. Use the question box found on your screen to submit your questions for the panel. We will read and address your questions aloud during the Q&A segment of the session. If you have a question for a specific person, it's good to put the name of that person in the question if you want it directed to a specific member of the panel. And now let's welcome our first panel member, Ari Ofsavit. Ari is a board member with the Boston-based transit advocacy group Transit Matters. He has also led campaigns with the advocacy group Livable Streets in Boston. Ari is a recent graduate of MIT, and during his graduate studies, he completed a research internship at the Chicago Transit Authority. Take it away, Ari.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone, for coming to this. I really hope that it's useful to folks. I'm going to talk about sort of the history of where Transit Matters came from and some of the sort of early and sort of smaller scale advocacy work that we've done and how we've sort of begun to work that into working more with the transit agency. And then I'm going to let Jim talk more about some of the bigger political pieces and some of the larger campaigns that we have. So before that, I'm actually going to go back to 1967. Which is when the MBTA, recently at that time, the MBTA had become the MBTA from the previous authority, came out with a style guide, which is shown on the left here. And it was one of the first ones in the country. It was all Helvetica, sort of bold colors, really forward thinking and really good design at that time. So that was 1967. Fast forward about 40 years. And the second panel that you see there is a a notice that there would be a change. And you can see that really none of the style guide was being followed. So sans serif fonts became serif fonts. The actually T logo on the top is just a capital letter T with a circle drawn around it. And then the text, the biggest piece is that the text on that is hard to decipher. Try to figure out what that means for someone walking by it, and they're just going to see another piece of paper. So Mark Abunya, who was one of the founders of Transit Matters, saw this and started a blog and said, I really think that we could have better design, and here's what I propose. And on the right is what he proposed, which is keeping with the design standards, but also just much more clear. So 2009, that was the beginning of Transit Matters. It has gone many places, but one of the things is that in 2016, the agency came out with a new design standard, which was based on the original, but had some updates. And you can see that it uses a lot of what was there before. And then I just pulled up a recent screen grab from a recent detour and shows that the agency is using that. So Transit Matters really began with advocates trying to get the agency to be better at communication. And a lot of what we try to do is on that communication side. The next thing that we started to do was show up at a lot of what advocacy is showing up at public meetings. So in 2016, there was a new bridge proposed, an old bridge that was falling down and needed to be repaired. We have a lot of old infrastructure in Boston, as I'm sure many of you have. And this bridge is one of the busier bridges in the city, especially for transit use. It has about 40 buses crossing it at peak hour, including one of the busiest routes in the city, and that's one of 5 routes to use this bridge. And so the state came up with a multimodal design, and as Fred Salvucci, who was 12 years the head of the MBTA, or head of Mass Department of Transportation, said, it's much easier to organize the pedestrians and the bicyclists because if their commute goes badly, they die. Luckily, that's generally not a problem we have in the transit industry, but it's much harder to organize people around advocacy when the worst that happens is that they're delayed. Now, this project was being done at a time when the bandwidth at the MBTA was particularly strained. It was right when we'd had 10 feet of snow in a month and the system had almost completely broke down. And the city had some issues dealing with that as well. So the state proposed what they called a multimodal bridge. And if you look at that multimodal bridge, it has really nice sidewalks. Current sidewalks there are about 4 feet wide, really well separated bike lanes. The state got to the point where this is what they were proposing for new infrastructure. And then you can see that there's a bus, and the bus is shown in traffic, and it's multimodal. What it doesn't show is that kind of traffic is something you might see early on a Sunday morning, but generally that bus would be stuck in a traffic jam of cars and take 10 or 15 minutes to go less than a mile. So a few of us showed up at a meeting, and we started just making noise about what about a bus lane, what about a bus lane, here's how a bus lane would work. Worked with the MBTA, brought them into the conversation because despite being in the same building, the state hadn't exactly gone and talked to the MBTA planners about it. Worked with other advocacy groups, so we actually had to narrow the sidewalk by about 1.5 feet, and we were able to catalyze the group called Walk Boston in a meeting where they were able to get up and say, we fully support a narrower sidewalk because people riding buses are our constituents as well, and came up with a new design that includes a bus lane. And this is really one of the first bus lanes to be included in a project. It's actually not built yet because it's a much larger project, but we get to the place where this bus lane was able to catalyze the city of Boston saying on the other end, let's put in a bus lane. The state on the other end, let's put in a bus lane, and is now being talked about a several mile BRT corridor. So it's really the missing link. We're talking a lot about data advocacy, and one of the things that we had here with data advocacy is that one of the great things about Transit Matters is that we're really able to catalyze the interests of a lot of nerds. The MBTA every evening shuts down its service for 4 hours overnight, and it has all the trains meet downtown, which they're able to do. People can make transfers, take the last train, which then connect to about 50 last buses that wait for those trains. And someone noticed that these last trains, which were scheduled to leave at about 12:50 or 12:55, were often leaving half an hour later. An issue for both the customer, because customers would sit on those trains for 20 minutes and give up. Predictions would drop off after the train didn't come for 20 minutes. Predictions would drop off of clocks, and it would appear that no train was or bus was coming at other stations. And also an issue for the agency because not only were the trains all being delayed half an hour, but all the buses waiting them were being delayed by half an hour, which meant the bus drivers were sitting there and getting paid overtime to not provide service. So we went through and sort of watched what happened and found that there was actually one train that was causing all of this trouble. There was a train that had sort of just a schedule quirk, was causing 9 other trains and 50 buses to be delayed every night. We found the people who can write code and write it quickly and reasonably well, and were able to show that that was the case. And then we were able to convince the T, although there were a couple of back and forths, we were able to convince them that, yes, this was an issue. They looked into it and found that, yes, one person was riding that one streetcar, and that person was causing 50 or 60 other vehicles to be delayed every day. The bottom right of this slide shows a chart, and the blue shows the observations for the year before for the last train, the time of day that it departed, and the orange shows the observations after, and the lines in the middle are medians. So we went from an average time when the trains would leave of 118 down to 106. And so we saved, theoretically, we saved every vehicle, these 60 vehicles, all operated 12 minutes earlier, which meant they got back to the yards 12 minutes earlier. So that's 60 vehicles times 12 minutes of operation time. Time saved for passengers who are riding the service, and even more time for maintenance of way to operate on the line overnight. And this also led into some of our proposals for morning and late night service, which Jim's going to talk about more later, but this was sort of a lead into it as well. I should say I met someone who found out that I was behind this and said, I always get that late bus, and I always was able to stay out at the bar a little later, and now I have to leave earlier, but I think it's a relatively small price to pay. But I guess people know me now enough to complain, and better if they're complaining to me than to the T. Finally, I'm going to talk about what we've done with the commuter rail system. So there was a many-year project to make one of the commuter rail stations in Boston accessible. But the problem was that it was, again, done at a time when the agency was very low on bandwidth. It was farmed out to an architect, and architects and railroad engineers are not exactly the same thing. So the architects came up with a station that was moved on to another platform, which was actually at the request of what was suggested by the community, but didn't work operationally. There was some lack of communication such that they proposed a station that would have enough conflicts that it would on one of the busiest commuter rail lines, it would make service very hard to provide at rush hour at the rate that it is today, and cause quite a few conflicting movements on the line. We looked at that. The upper left is one of the advocates who has now actually gone over to work and project management at the agency, and I would say that the agency is lucky to have him there, despite the fact that he can now do much less work on the advocacy side. We're okay with that. The graphic that he came up with to show why things weren't working at Auburndale with the trains and which track they're on, and it was, I think, done in PowerPoint or maybe Paint, maybe not the best graphic design. But we catalyzed that, and we've moved that toward our regional rail report. We've done a lot of the same things, but looking at the whole system and how to run the commuter rail system that we have more efficiently and provide better service, especially to many of the relatively large outlying communities in Boston. And if you think relatively large, it's places like Worcester and Providence, which have 200,000 people in the city and more around them. And many of those areas serve a lot of lower income communities. So the regional rail report came out, and thanks to a vote from the FMCB, which both Monica and Joe are on, we actually made the front page of the paper. Well, first we made the front page of the paper earlier this year when Boston was rated the city with the worst traffic in the country. Recently, we made the front page when the T-Board committed to overhauling the commuter rail system. And then we also made the front page of the tabloid, which is calling it the new big dig and saying that it's going to cost a lot of money and we're going to build a tunnel, none of which is really true. So now I'll hand it over to Jim to talk I guess there'll be some questions, and then Jim will talk some more in depth about some of these efforts.
Great. Thank you, Ari, for your presentation. It's a good look at some of the sort of like nuts and bolts things that, you guys as advocates are bringing to the table to help the agency, perform at a higher level. How do you guys pick projects you want to work on?
It's almost like we're a low-level consulting firm or law firm. We'll take whatever walks through the door. A lot of this has come out of just things that people notice and people who are active in the group bring to our attention. So, for instance, the late night bus service was just one person who, I think it was from Twitter, complained about why am I always waiting for these trains late at night? And when a lot of people really aren't paying attention, most of us are for good reasons asleep, and worked to find that solution. So yeah, it's a lot of that, but we have become more focused as the organization has grown. We've only hired our first staff person within the last year, but as the organization has grown, we've become more focused. But a lot of that focus is focusing volunteers on those projects.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you again, Ari. Our next speaker is Jim Aloisi, who is also a board member at Transit Matters. Jim is a Boston-based writer, transit advocate, and consultant who works with clients in the transportation and sustainability sectors. As Massachusetts Transportation Secretary in 2009, Jim guided a landmark transportation reform and restructuring initiative and authorized a pioneering effort to release a complete MBTA dataset at no cost in order to improve transparency and encourage development of web-based and mobile applications. Welcome, Jim. So please proceed.
Thanks for having me. So I was reading something earlier today in preparation for a class I teach, and it's the following comment, which is transportation is a technological behemoth bedeviled by human behavior. Now, that comment was made in the context of somebody talking about vehicular miles traveled and modal shift, but you could think about that in the context of the topic that we're discussing today, right? A technological behemoth bedeviled by human behavior, because the essence of what we are doing at Transit Matters is to really understand how to make change, which is at the core of understanding human behavior. And I want to underscore something about our technical advocacy. We don't knock on doors. I don't disparage or diminish the importance of advocacy groups who do that. That's an important part of advocacy. That's not what we do. We get into the weeds. We think outside the box. We filter our thinking through the prism of what is achievable, what's practical. We really pride ourselves on developing practical solutions that are either highly cost effective or that actually save money. And so we come to the table as progressive transit and rail advocates who also care about how the money gets spent. We're certainly not in the business of advising public sector officials to engage in profligate spending. To the contrary, we try to say that we can find ways to deliver better service, either more cost effectively or at less overall expense. And so, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say, which I need to just let everyone on this webinar know, that most of what we do would be ineffective, in my judgment, if we didn't have open-minded, welcome partners on the public side of the fence. And that includes the two people from the Fiscal and Management Control Board who are on the webinar, but it also includes the Secretary of Transportation, and it includes a staff of really dedicated people at the MBTA. We may challenge them, and we do challenge them from time to time, but in challenging them, we're not doing anything other than trying to engage in a collaborative dialogue with them. And so that's the sort of overall message I want to leave with you all. Now, looking at the slides, the first slide is basically a snapshot of an article that we wrote that kicked off an initiative that we called Night Bus. So the MBTA had been running late night service on the subway system as well as the surface system. And as a significant cost-cutting measure, it was ended back in 2015. We felt that Boston, our message was Boston never stops working, and neither should the T. But we appreciated the point that keeping the subway open all night long is a pretty expensive proposition. So we wrote the article that you just saw as the way to kick off this initiative. And then what you're seeing now is our initial plan. We said, look, what if we didn't have subway open at night, but what if we kept a robust bus system in place overnight? We called it Night Bus. That was our branding. And it was our way of saying we can do a lot more with a lot less cost. We were trying to bring a measure of social equity to the table. Think about the people who are using the bus, who would be using the bus at 2 in the morning, at 3 in the morning, people working in the restaurant, service industries, hospital industries, security industries, not necessarily among the highest paid folks. They're spending money taking cabs or Ubers or having a relative get up in the wee hours. We wanted to find a way to make that easier for them, and to also have that public presence of the MBTA available to people. Because frankly, buses late at night are good for mobility. They're also good for public safety. Eyes on the street are significant. The next slide will show you some of the data that the T put together with us, and I would say we work collaboratively with the T service planners as well as the municipal transportation planners to come up with a data-driven approach to this. And you can see, if you know anything about the city of Boston, you can see where people are going in the early morning to work, where they're coming from, the neighborhoods that they live in. A lot of those neighborhoods are disadvantaged neighborhoods or lower income neighborhoods. The same thing at night, where are people heading to? And you see this vast number of people heading actually across Boston Harbor to communities like East Boston, Chelsea, Revere. Again, largely disadvantaged areas and populations. And because the harbor's there and the subway's not running, either people are forced to swim or they're forced to hire an Uber or a taxi. We now have a way to get them to home. The Fiscal Management Control Board, the first thing they did was they implemented one component of Night Bus, and it was the early morning service. And you can see here, it's a pretty robust expansion of the first bus. And I think it was nothing but an unbridled success from day one. It was a success so quickly and so manifestly that the Fiscal Management Control Board made the pilot a permanent part of the service pretty quickly. And so that's an example of how you make change. It's an example of, and it's also an example of how you take something like a late night service and reimagine it, rethink it, and not let the perfect get in the way of the possible. You can see another indication of the technical-oriented, data-oriented approach to dealing with this. Just trying to figure out where the demand was coming from. And by doing that, we could identify were these communities that were largely suffering from income inequality, were people of color, where people were working. And we matched all that data up together, again, in a collaboration with municipalities and the T. And we're able now to provide people with later service on the bus and earlier service on the bus. We have a gap in between. It's a small gap, and we aspire to close that gap. But overall, we put out a solution to the T that the T embraced, worked with us, and is now providing real service to real people every day of the week. The next slide is our Regional Rail Initiative, which is another significant ongoing initiative. And I want you to see what we've written there, which is it's a 21st century business model. Right now, we run commuter rail in Massachusetts, I say, like it's 1965 or 1975, with the assumption that everyone has a 9-to-5 job and everyone lives in the burbs and everyone wants to go in one direction early in the morning and then the same direction back in the evening. A lot of people still have 9-to-5 jobs, but as we all know, in the 21st century, the economy runs very differently than it did in 1975. And so what we proposed was to reimagine and rethink what we call commuter rail, or something called regional rail, which was a new service delivery model and a new business model, a new way of thinking about inner-city rail. And again, we wrote an article in Commonwealth Magazine that laid out our thinking on this. These articles are important. I want to just pause for a second. We write a lot of content. The content is something that satisfies two goals. The first goal is it forces us to really curate and edit what we're thinking, right? by forcing ourselves to write up what we're proposing in an article, we're asking our members to kick the tires on the idea very hard. We don't want to go public with something and be embarrassed. So the discipline of actually writing an article that we know will be read by influencers forces us to make sure that if we're saying something, we're pretty confident that we're right and that we've got backup for it. So that's number one. Number two, it obviously gives us a platform to have the influencers see our thinking, have the benefit of our thinking, and it's the sort of platform that's the springboard for further discussion. And so Joe Aiello, who's the chairman of the Fiscal Management Control Board, at one of the meetings said commuter rail was costing way too much money for way too little ridership. And he was right, and we agreed. And what we thought is, look, let's take that observation and let's find a practical, cost-effective way to solve it. We are in the worst traffic congestion in the country in Metro Boston right now, worse than Los Angeles. The national data tells us that. We know it from experience. People want to resolve the traffic congestion dilemma. They also want to have a transit and rail system that responds to today's economy, to today's values. They also want to have a transit and rail system that's responding to the displacement that's happening out of the inner core of Boston because of income inequality and higher housing costs. People are moving out. So someone who might have, in a few years ago, been within a quarter-mile walk of a key bus route has been displaced and is finding themselves either having to drive, which is very expensive, or having to take commuter rail from places like Brockton or the North Shore or the West. And so commuter rail, or what we're calling regional rail, has become a new lifeline, in my judgment, for the 21st century. And one of the things that we did, we wrote a report in February 2018, published report, very thorough, very well annotated, very well received. And I wanted to show you a page from the report because we tried to make our proposal as legible as we could to the average reader. And the average reader meaning not just transit and rail advocates or folks within the T, but people in the media, people in the legislature, people who would be helping advance the decision making. And so you see here that we tried to boil down our message into very simple 5 critical components that were legible, easy to understand, and easy to implement. Same thing in advancing that idea that this says begin with rationalizing fates, and of course it should say fares, although I'm now intrigued by the idea of rationalizing fates. But you can see that in this overall approach that we take about being cost-effective and highly impactful, we say, look, let's take an incremental approach. And you begin with changing organization before you adopt electronics, before you actually build heavy infrastructure. The point being that if you're going to transition to a modern system, you do so thoughtfully, step by step, incrementally. And the last thing you do is the expense of infrastructure. By the time you get to that, you've done everything else that you need to do up front and first. And so success, the FMCB, in its wisdom, a few weeks ago, adopted a vision for commuter rail. It may not be precisely our vision, but we believe that we began the conversation in February of 2018 in earnest, that we added real value to the conversation with very specific plans based in data, based in experience, based in best practices, looking both nationally and globally. And we were able to provide people with the comfort and the confidence to know that if they took the important step of moving forward with this transition, that they would be doing so in an environment where the facts, the data, the experience, the best practices all back them up. I specifically declined to say bold step because I think we too often say bold when we don't mean bold. Some of the things that we're talking about here may appear bold, but they're really essential to the proper functioning of a 21st century urban and suburban transit and rail system. And so I think as transit advocates, need to be careful not to call everything new bold. because bold sounds like it's exotic. And nothing that we're doing is exotic. What we're doing, and I'll end on this note, what we're doing is we're challenging people to say we are almost at the quarter century mark of the 21st century. And we've got people in Massachusetts, including the woman who heads the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, saying that we are not even now able to achieve a 21st century transportation system. Well, if we can't achieve that in the first 25 years of the century, when are we going to do it? What Transit Matters hopes to do is to push the envelope and to politely, collaboratively, but persistently advocate for change and to back it up with the data and the facts that will persuade people we're right. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk.
All right. Thank you, Jim. That's some great insight about what you all at Transit Matters are really accomplishing in terms of transit success in the Boston area. So, question for you: how do you measure your success as a technical advocacy group?
I think we measure success by, frankly, looking at the initiatives that we propose and whether we've been able to take those initiatives and make them actionable, right? I mean, there really isn't, there's no better way to measure success than actually putting things into action, into place. I'm a big believer in doing, not talking, although obviously I do a lot of talking. But whether it's the night bus initiative with early morning service and the late night service, or the regional rail, which has now been given a jump start by the Fiscal Management Control Board, or the initiatives that Ari spoke about, our measure of success is, can we provide people with the tools, the facts, the insights that they need to do something impactful? And impactful doesn't have to mean on a grandiose scale. Sometimes impactful means on a micro level. But all of these things come together and accumulate to create an environment where I think our credibility is enhanced. And by enhancing our credibility, we make it easier for us the next time to make an even greater impact.
Great. All right. Thank you again, Jim, for your insight. But that's great. All right. Now we're going to switch gears from the advocate side of our conversation to the agency side. Let me welcome Joe Aiello. He is the chair of the MBTA Fiscal and Management Control Board. Joe is a recently retired partner at Meridian Infrastructure Managers, a private equity investor developer of infrastructure. And he has worked on a number of major infrastructure projects such as the Maryland Purple Line, Light Rail, Port of Miami Tunnel, and the Long Beach Courthouse. So take it away, Joe.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me preface my remarks by going back to what was described at the beginning, which was then Secretary Aloisi's decision in 2009 to make full access to data available to folks outside the MBTA. Without that move, much of what we're talking about today would simply not be possible. So I rarely say very nice things about former Secretary Aloisi, but let me say that. Anyway, to move on, that was a joke, by the way. I've known Jim for a very long time. So I thought it'd be helpful just to set a little bit of context here for the MBTA and our what has come to be, I believe, a great partnership with Transit Matters. Many of you may have remembered the severe winter we had in 2015, which caused the MBTA to really melt down and not be able to deliver service in a really, really surprising way to its customers, but not to longtime observers of the organization. The governor convened a special panel to understand what happened, and what you would typically imagine, there was a failure to focus on asset management, but just as equally was a real loss of human capital in the organization. the T had suffered a big retirement period, had failed to replace an adequate number of professionals during that period. And then during the crisis leading up to the winter of 2015 and coming out of 2015, also lost a number of professionals who either retired because they could or went to work for consulting firms or other agencies. It was in that environment that the governor appointed, with the approval of the legislature, a board who would have a 5-year term, which began in July of 2015. So the 5 members are referred to collectively as the Fiscal and Management Control Board. And we were given certain, I guess you would call them powers, such as the ability to outsource certain kinds of currently insourced functions as part of the responsibility over 5 years. And we also were required to report to the legislature on an annual basis. And we were required to meet in public session 3 times a month, so 3 times a month for a board, which we have been doing for over 4.5 years now, just about 4.5 years. So as we the board stepped into the situation at the MBTA, the first thing that we discovered that while the special panel that the governor had convened had reported on a backlog of the state of good repair, there was very, very little data to support any of the numbers that the staff had come up with. And we have subsequently found, but it took us 3 years to get to this point, that the state of good repair backlog was literally double what the staff had estimated at that time. And we're currently in the area of about $12 billion of investments required to bring the system up to what would be considered a state of good repair. There was absolutely no focus on the customers. This was a place that was focused on moving trains, moving buses, and customers more or less got in the way. That really was one element of what was really a human capital crisis. We had some very, very good people. They were beaten down. They had very, very, very low expectations of what senior management and the board and elected officials were going to do on their behalf and on behalf of the organization. And they weren't anywhere near enough of them. So all around, that was a pretty bad situation that we stepped into. We just focused on 4 things. One was to bring the customer back to a primary focus, and it's not just customer communication and customer centricity, but also making sure everybody's looking at issues like safety through the lens of the customer to make sure that they understand the centrality of making sure people can get to work, got a medical appointment, and get back home safely at the end of the day. A bit of financial discipline. We inherited a budget that was growing at about 7% compounded growth while shrinking the delivery of service. We have turned that around by having 4 consecutive years of about 2.2% cost growth on a compounded basis, and while adding additional service, including 10,000 additional annual trips on the current commuter rail system, adding new service to a couple of communities like Chelsea and Revere, et cetera. We wanted to make sure that we were able to start having some very impactful improvements to the conditions of the physical system. So we developed an accelerated capital investment program. We have been averaging about just under $300 million a year in capital spend on the current system. This year, for the first time, we hit $1 billion in spend, and we're on our way to averaging $1.6 billion a year, which we will maintain that level for at least the next decade. And then finally, we found that there was no strategic plan. There was no statement of shared values, shared vision. And despite all the insanity that was going on, we knew the centrality of having to make sure that we all stated and bought into a common culture surrounded by values and pointed to the direction that the organization wanted to get to. We got a lot of laughs from staff and outsiders when we declared that our intent was to become one of the premier transit systems globally. Our view was that the Boston metropolitan area competes on a global basis, and it needs a globally premier transit system to ensure mobility that continues to support its ability to compete and provide opportunities and the quality of life that we believe its citizens deserve. This gets down to the role of transit matters and the question of, what can you learn from the outsiders? The T was a place that was culturally insular. When you get beaten up all the time, you tend to view everybody else as the enemy. And the only people you really talk to for ideas is the consulting community. Now, there's a lot of talent in the consulting community. And having been a consultant, 30 years ago, I know that a lot of times one of the primary things you do is you want to make sure you have repeat business with your clients. And therefore, you sometimes don't throw a high inside fastball at somebody's chin when you should be throwing a high inside fastball at somebody's chin. And you don't necessarily bring in national global expertise to try to treat the problem. So there was a very insular environment among the staff and with the consultants, and an expectation that they would continue to slog their way through it. We decided at the board level that we really did need to, I have here the term breaking eggs, we really needed to break that view. And that's why we were delighted and encouraged Transit Matters as they were doing really a fine piece of technical work. And that's a key. If they had not been doing fine technical work and publishing it so that all could read, they would not have established themselves as a player at the table. And we're delighted that they organized, that they grew, they got more sophisticated. And while there was a great deal of resistance from the staff, it was our job as a board to encourage that collaboration. And we did that by the words we used and the actions we took at the board meetings. And it was also, Monica is going to be following me, much of the work of Monica, working with Transit Matters and with some of the other some of the other organizations that were advocating for different thinking at the T, to go into meetings with the staff and to really be a monitor of staff and Transit Matters or other advocacy groups' interactions to make sure that each party was really listening to the other party. And we took a view that there was a need to really think about all sorts of ways of doing business a little bit differently. And we encouraged the staff to experiment and to tell us that they were going to experiment with different kinds of services. This late night service regime and early bus service that Jim Aloisi talked about earlier was an example of that. We knew that there was a possibility that some of this may not pan out. 3 out of 4 of their ideas around early morning, late night service turned to be something that we adopted permanently. That was great. One of them failed. That was okay. That was just not the norm at the T. It was a very, very risk-averse environment. And the board took it on their responsibility to allow the staff the freedom to be able to experiment a little bit and sometimes have things not work out the way that they want to. So with that, I will say creating a culture where these things, where ideas from outsiders can be welcomed, can be discussed, was an important part of sort of what the board did. And I think one of the other things that happened just sort of in the ecosystem of advocacy, Transit Matters' success spawned many other organizations that had really more specific and limited geographic influence to come up, many of whom now collaborate with Transit Matters. And it really has brought a whole bunch of new people to the table with really, really good ideas. And I can tell you the board is just delighted with that, the sort of the new culture that's here at the T.
All right. Thank you, Joe. That was really interesting. And, I like how you highlighted how the sort of situation that the agency was facing, and then how sort of shifting the culture helped you embrace these sort of outside groups and the value that they can provide. Do you think that there's a connection between this idea of a customer-centric approach and relationships with advocacy groups? Maybe you could speak to that for a second.
Yeah, there certainly is a very direct relationship. And one of the things we did institute was a public comment period at the front end of every one of our meetings, where they could comment on any of the board topics that were going to be discussed that day. They frequently had the materials that were going to be discussed made available to them ahead of time, so they understood the content. And the filter of really understanding how proposed service changes, fair policy changes, et cetera, were going to affect people's lives really informed the decision-making at the T, but also really informed the thought processes that the technical and policy staff were taking under consideration. So, yeah, very, very direct relationship.
All right, great. Thanks again, Joe. Our final speaker is Monica Tibbetts-Nutt. She is the Vice Chair of the MBTA Fiscal and Management Control Board. She is also the Executive Director of the 128 Business Council. Monica works in regional planning and transportation, and her areas of specialty are transportation planning, urban design, and sustainability. Monica's work experience includes public sector transit planning at both the MBTA Advisory Board and as the Executive Director of TransitWorks. So take it away, Monica.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. So what I kind of want to talk about is building a little bit off of the previous presenters and really talking about the evolution of transit agencies, especially around transportation planning. So this is actually a picture from the 1930s of a bus operating in Boston. And the reason I really want to show this is in transportation, in the legacy systems, the way that we had approached transportation planning hadn't really changed much since the early 1900s. It was responding to our municipalities, responding to what elected officials needed, responding to what we thought these community coalitions needed, and trying to build the projects completely internally without a lot of input from outside of the agency. And so as we kind of moved into around 2009, really talking about the release of the data and being one of the first transit agencies to really do it, it was really, I think, kind of a reckoning for a lot of the agencies to figure out, okay, now that we've released this data, now that we're kind of giving advocacy groups, regular citizens a look behind the curtain, what role do they have within our organizations? How do we better bring them in internally, not just as consultants, but actually thinking of them as a major component of the way that we not only think about projects, think about project planning, but how we're actually going to take it from project planning into making the corrections, making the changes we need to into the actual project delivery. So like I said, it really did start with the release of this data. We, as I said, were one of the first agencies to do it, and the depth of the data that was released was quite impressive. And I think looking at the types of people we have in our region, especially a lot of students, a lot of people who feel very passionately not only about their communities, but about the types of service being provided to them, really jumped on top of this and took a lot of this data, not only to educate themselves, but took it to figure out, okay, here are the projects we wanted, here are the changes that we wanted to see in our system. How can we use this newly available information and start to integrate ourselves into this process and actually start to build better projects that are really focused on the communities themselves and coming from the customer standpoint? The other thing that I think happened in addition to the release of this data is newer tools. Previously, as many people that worked in transportation planning, a lot of us were trained on AutoCAD and ArcGIS, two incredibly expensive software packages that a lot of people just didn't have access to unless you were a student learning or were at a larger firm. And I think now that a lot of this data is so open source, and now that you have GIS data that you can access online, that you can use in an open source manner, and being able to access all of that data, you can start to really, via YouTube and a lot of different webinars, teach yourself a lot of the skills and tools that transportation planners were taught through their programs. This, for example, is a screenshot of Remix, which is a software very similar to a lot of the softwares we were trained on, but it's kind of more new school. And what it does is it takes not only information from transit agencies, which you'll actually see the timetables of the MBTA Route 1 bus on here, but also took information from other agencies, took information from other groups, whether it was accident data, biking data, and started to put it into one tool that general members of the public could access, the advocacy groups could access. And out of that, these different advocacy groups, these different nonprofits started to release their own reports, started to create their own data repositories that then other public officials, other members of the public could access. So starting to collate everything that they were taking in, everything that they had the time, much like Transit Matters, to actually disseminate and putting it into a visual, more user-friendly manner, so that not only could people who were taking the time to learn these skills access the information, but the general public could see it in a way that public transit agencies have never released it before. Now that the MBTA has moved more into, looking at the dashboard, having much more transparency in our data, we are now releasing a lot of this and mapping it, imaging it for the public. But prior to that, a lot of this really fell onto the advocacy groups and to private citizens themselves. And out of that, you have groups like Transit Matters, and you have groups across the country. This is actually from Transit Center in New York City, who are taking this information and writing and doing a lot of writing. As Jim had mentioned, writing and being able to actually express those ideas, express those opinions in a way that the general public can understand is so incredibly important. One of the documents that Transit Center had actually come out with is who's on board, who's not on board. And it took a lot of the work that advocates across the country were doing and put it into one central report that was giving a very clear, customer-focused idea of what the experience among these transit agencies, among these different systems was for the riders. And for especially marginalized communities and marginalized riders who don't have time to come and, come to a meeting at noon on a Monday to talk to the board, or can't come to a night meeting because they're working or they need childcare. And it gives them a voice. Each of these advocacy groups gives a voice to these communities that previously had no way to express what their needs were, what their challenges were. And now they're giving us an idea of what the opportunities are. And I think for transit agencies across the country, it has elevated not only the quality of our projects, but it's elevated the culture within the agencies and really elevated the industry as a whole. Because I think as opposed to, going out for public comment and checking a box, we really want that two-way dialogue. We want these relationships. We want their expert opinion, because they really are experts on their commutes. They're experts in their communities and want to integrate them into the process. And I think out of that, as Joe had mentioned, we're just doing better projects. And we're doing projects in a way that it actually meets the needs of the communities. And I think we're also doing it at a pace that we haven't really been able to do it before, because not only do you have internal capacity, you now have kind of these outside consultants like Transit Matters who are doing so much work on our behalf. And then we can take all of that and really put together planning processes and projects that start to address a lot of, I think, the shortcomings of our transit system and the shortcomings of some of our municipal projects, and take us into that next kind of 21st century, 22nd century, and really start to think about what these systems should look like.
Thank you, Monica. That was great. So how do you think transit agencies should review the planning suggestions that these external or advocacy groups propose?
I mean, I think we should be reviewing them in the exact same manner we would a consultant's report that we paid for. really looking at what was the data that they used to come to these conclusions? What are they trying to accomplish with this particular project? Do we find that we have seen internally or externally that there is an actual need for that? And as Joe said, pilot them. Be okay with failing and trying to pilot them in a quick manner, trying to do the evaluation the same way we would other projects, but also allowing those entities to do their own evaluation and coming together at the table to decide, okay, what does success look like? What does failure look like? What do we want to do if this is a successful project? How do we move that forward? And making it, as I said, a conversation. It's a team, it's teamwork, and it's really working together on this plan as opposed to us putting something out and having to have them respond to it. They're putting something out, we're responding to it, and then coming together to find what we think is going to be a mutually satisfactory project.
I think that's interesting and a good lesson for like treating these sort of proposals with the same seriousness that you might give, your own sort of thing. So what about sometimes there might be an outside proposal that doesn't quite meet the standards that you're looking for? Do you have any advice for agencies about how you might go about rejecting something or dealing with the sort of the community on that?
I mean, I think it really goes back to what are the shortcomings. One of the things that our staff have identified is that in some of those areas, they just didn't have the time or necessarily the expertise or the resources to take it to the level that they needed to for us to better evaluate it. And so our staff are like, okay, well, what additional resources do they need? Internally, what can we do? And I think that has been the most important thing for creating that level playing field. So if you are coming from a marginalized neighborhood, a marginalized community, and you don't have the resources or the time or the expertise like an organization as Transit Matters, then we can add that additional assistance. And I think that's going to be the most important thing to create more of these equitable projects and to make sure that we're not leaving out communities that might not have the resources to put together such polished projects as an organization as Transit Matters can. And I think that's what agencies are going to have to do, is really step in and really use the internal expertise and combine it with the community expertise to put forward better projects.
All right, great. Thank you, Monica. I think that was really engaging and informative for our agencies and advocates too. So now we're going to move on to engaging, having a little Q&A with our panelists. If you are in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, you can submit your questions via the question box found on your screen, and we'll direct them to the panel members. And we'll do our best to answer all the questions that you all have provided. So first, a question for our advocate side, so Ari and Jim. How has your advocacy changed as Transit Matters has matured as an organization?
I'll jump in on that really quickly, and then let Jim go. I think a lot of what we've done is we've become a lot more judicious in how we advocate. So we never have wanted to be the ones to necessarily show up at a meeting and yell at people or protest, protest things. But I think we're really getting to the place where, amongst other things, working with allies like Joe and Monica, where we're sometimes able to do things on the back end and really make it easier for us and easier for the agency and something that looks better for everyone. So I would say that's a lot of what's changed over time.
Yeah, I also think as we've developed our organization and we've grown in our membership, we're able to identify a larger number of initiatives and we're able to have longer lead times. So there are a bunch of folks who are working on, I can think of 3 specific initiatives right now that we haven't gone public with because they're just under development. And so partly we've changed by maturing, by having a reputation and a brand that people are drawn to, and so that enables us to increase our membership, both its interest and diversity. And so I think people over the next say, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, we'll be seeing a variety of new initiatives coming from Transit Matters that are the result of our ability to grow and sustain our membership because of the work we've done in the past.
Great. Yeah, I think what's as Ari sort of said, like what started off as just a few people with one idea, over the years has sort of become something much bigger, and you all are really making an impact now. So this is sort of a question for everybody, but maybe the agency people could Joe and Monica, you could tackle it first, and then advocacy people. What should agencies and advocates do if they find that agencies and advocates are too entrenched in an adversarial relationship? How do you break the sort of cycle of distrust that may exist?
Super easy question. I think that is tough because I think a lot of organizations and a lot of agencies have a lot of history together. What I have found is just doing your best to come to it with an open mind. I think staff can be very, very helpful with that. And I think letting staff talk to the advocates first can be very helpful because they are coming from the standpoint of what's going to be in the best interest of the agency, and then going to leadership after that and trying to figure out what the common ground is going to be. But I think trying to keep it as factual as possible, and staff is much better able to do that, is really the most important part of that. So you're not letting history or egos get in the way of good projects.
This is Jim. I also want to make a point. Transit Matters is trying to get good stuff done. We're not trying to sabotage anybody at the T, and there are many occasions. I'm not going to say every occasion, but there are many occasions where we'll give a sort of heads up to someone and basically say, we're thinking of doing this. What do you think? Maybe you want to do this before we suggest it publicly, right? And so we're really not about positioning people or embarrassing people or sabotaging people. We're really about collaborating with people. That doesn't mean that in every instance, the staff and Transit Matters are gonna sort of be happy about one another at every moment. That's not the way the world works. But I think transparency is important. We don't play secret squirrel with anybody. We have I'm a former Secretary of Transportation. We have a deep respect for people who serve in the public sector. Many of us have been in the public sector. Some of us aspire to be in the public sector. And so we don't view the public sector as anything but an important collaborator with us. And if there are times when we butt heads, we try to make it few and far between. We try to use candor and respect to get over those hurdles.
Great. I think the two things I heard there were sort of about opening channels between people at agencies who really do things, the staff and advocates, and then also making sure that both sides sort of approach the relationship with respect for each other, which I think is important too. One other thing that's being asked from the audience, and maybe Jim or Ari, you could respond to this, is maybe just a little background on Transit Matters. So like, how big is your organization? How big is the board? Where does the sort of momentum or funding come from? Things like that.
Sure. I actually have lost track of exactly how many board members we have. I think it may be about 9 right now. And we have, we're primarily a volunteer group. We have one paid position that's a recent position. We have a person who has the title of Chief Operating Officer, who is a former board member. His name is Jared Johnson. He has deep roots in the community, and he has deep roots not just on the transportation side of the house, but the housing side of the house, which we find really useful because, as people on this webinar know, transportation issues and housing issues, among others, are closely intertwined. And so we do have some foundation support for that position, and we're in the process of seeking other nonprofit foundation support to maintain a modest staff. And we've got a relationship with the Conservation Law Foundation that allows us to use their facilities here in Boston for office space and meetings. So we've been able to take ourselves from a totally volunteer group that did its work on the basis of very, very modest contributions to a group that's now modestly funded, and we'll see where it takes us. We conduct a variety of social events. We have both beer in transit social events and coffee in transit social events, where we invite people to come, to listen to us, to work with us, to socialize with us. And we have found that method of outreach really works in terms of targeting the kinds of folks who are sort of naturally drawn to the work we do.
I'd add two very quick things. One is that we are really still do lean on volunteers, and finding in all different cities, there are probably people who are very interested, and engaging them can I think be very beneficial. Even if the volunteers will sometimes come up with ideas that maybe the transit agency thought of and not take it into account, but often will really come up with new things, and that actually happens within Transit Matters as well. The other one is that we are lucky also in our local ecosystem to have a lot of parallel organizations who look at street design, bicycling, walking, some other transit pieces, as well as nationally. So we really lean on them as well.
Great, thanks. All right, to the panelists, is there anything else that you wanted to say that you did not get to say? Because I think we're coming to the end of our time. All right, so that's it for today's webinar. Everyone on the call, please join me in thanking our great panel members, Ari Offsweet, Jim Aloisi, Joe Aiello, and Monica Tibbetts-Nutt. You all provided some great insight into how advocates and agencies can work together to make great things happen. To the audience members, thank you everyone for being part of our great session. I hope everybody learned a lot of good lessons. Just some notes here. Today's slides, the audio recording, and some other resources will be posted on our webinar series page within the next couple of weeks. And this is the final Future View webinar for the 2019 season. Stay in touch with us on apta.com to find out more about our 2020 Future View series, which will be starting in a couple months. Thank you.